Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact minute your clock shows when these words reach you. Time and place matter in stories like this because every disappearance begins with a single moment that refuses to stay buried. It was the summer of 1967, a humid July afternoon in a small Midwestern town where people still left their screen doors unlocked and the hum of cicadas filled the air long after dusk. A quiet residential street, lined with oaks and telephone poles, ordinary in every way. And then, sometime between 3:30 and 4:15 that afternoon, an infant vanished from a shaded front porch without a sound. No witnesses, no ransom note. No tire tracks on the gravel drive, just an empty blanket on a wooden chair and a bottle tipped on its side, still half full of milk, beginning to sour in the heat. For the next 43 years, that single porch would become a shrine to an unanswered question. The baby's name isn't the part that matters most. What matters is the fracture left behind. A young couple living in a rented white clapboard house at the edge of town, a place with a garden, a laundry line, and a front porch that faced the late afternoon sun. The father worked swing shifts at the foundry. The mother stayed home, raising their 2 children. The older barely 3, the younger only 10 weeks. On that day, she was folding laundry, a radio playing softly through the kitchen window. When the phone rang, she stepped inside to answer it. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When she returned, the porch was empty. Neighbors later said they saw nothing unusual. A postal truck had passed by. A boy on a bicycle tossed newspapers door to door. One woman recalled a tan sedan idling near the corner, engine running, driver unseen. But there was nothing anyone could point to with certainty. It was the kind of neighborhood where you recognized faces more than names, where anyone could walk by without question. The first few minutes after a child disappears are unlike any other measurement of time. They stretch and collapse all at once. The mother searched the porch, the yard, and the sidewalk. She called for her baby's name again and again, her voice carrying down the block until someone dialed the operator. By the time the first patrol car arrived, the sky was beginning to thicken with late-day heat. Officers noted the details that would become the earliest entries in the file. Blanket found on porch chair, cotton, floral pattern, glass bottle nearby, contents warm. No signs of forced entry to the house or yard. Footprints on the porch consistent with residents. The neighbor across the street heard a dog bark once, then silence. The responding officer wrote the phrase, "possible child wandering," before crossing it out. By 4:50 p.m., the case had already shifted from misunderstanding to emergency. They began at the creek behind the property, calling the child's name through the reeds. Volunteers gathered by dusk, housewives, factory workers still in uniform, and a few teenagers carrying flashlights. The search went on until midnight, ending with nothing more than the sound of frogs and the reflection of lantern light on the water. The next morning, the local newspaper printed the headline, "Infant Missing from Front Porch. Search Continues." A black and white photo of the young couple appeared beneath it, both pale, both dazed. In the photo, the mother's hands are clasped tight, as if she's holding something invisible. By the end of the first week, the town had turned its routines into ritual. The grocery clerk taped flyers to the counter. The pastor mentioned the baby's name in every prayer. Officers combed the rail yards and empty barns. There were theories of a transient worker passing through, a wandering relative, an animal attack, and even suggestions of the river, but no evidence matched any of them. Days became weeks. The house remained under watch, though there was little left to guard except the silence. Inside, the crib stayed made, the small clothes folded. The mother refused to move them. "In case," she told one officer. "In case." Summer faded into fall. The cicadas went quiet, replaced by the sound of wind through dry leaves. The missing infant's photograph, the only one taken since birth, began to yellow at the corners where tape held it to the kitchen wall. The father stopped giving interviews. The mother stopped leaving the house. By the first anniversary, the file labeled "Missing Juvenile Infant" had swollen to more than 200 pages. Tips came from as far as Tennessee and Kansas, each one examined and dismissed. A stroller found by a rest stop turned out to belong to someone else. A blanket mailed anonymously to the sheriff's office was tested and proved unrelated. Every false lead added another layer of exhaustion. The case, as it was officially called, reached its quiet phase. The one detectives never liked to name aloud. It meant time had taken control. But for one officer, the file never fully closed. He was young then, in his early 30s, meticulous, and not given to speculation. He kept the infant's photo in a folder inside his desk long after others had shifted assignments. Each year on the anniversary, he would call the family, check for updates, and mark the date in his logbook. He once told a colleague, "Until you find out what happened, you're still looking." That quiet persistence would matter more than anyone could have guessed, because decades later, long after the family moved away, after the street changed names and the foundry shut down, a simple at-home DNA kit bought online by a grown woman trying to learn about her ancestry would set in motion a chain of emails, lab confirmations, and phone calls that reached back across 43 years to that same porch. When it was over, the truth would turn out to be stranger, sadder, and more human than anyone had imagined. By the second day, the town had become an open wound of rumor and routine. Patrol cars idled at intersections. Deputies walked shoulder to shoulder through overgrown fields, their radios crackling with static. Volunteers combed the creek bed again, forming human chains that reached from the bridge to the far bend. Every few minutes, someone would call the child's name, pause, and listen for a sound that never came. The silence became its own presence, heavier than any noise. Inside the house, investigators worked methodically. They photographed the porch from every angle, dusted the railing for prints, collected fibers from the blanket, and measured distances between footprints. Each item went into a brown paper envelope, labeled, sealed, and signed. But in truth, there was very little to collect. No forced entry, no ransom demand, no blood. Just an absence that didn't behave like a crime scene should. The parents sat in the kitchen under the bright overhead light while a detective took notes. The mother's voice shook when she tried to recount the timeline, the phone call, the 2 minutes she was inside. The sound. She didn't hear any creak of steps, no slam of a screen door, and no cry. The detective asked the same questions in slightly different ways, hoping the repetition might loosen some buried memory. It didn't. Her husband, pale and tense, answered questions about neighbors, visitors, any family disputes, debts, or strangers seen nearby. Each answer came back ordinary. By nightfall, state investigators arrived. They carried heavier equipment, tripods, tape recorders, portable lamps, and a kind of formal detachment that local officers both admired and resented. The house glowed with camera flashes late into the night, each burst freezing the same grief in different light. Outside, reporters began to gather along the sidewalk. The first televised statement came just before 11. Authorities confirm an ongoing search for an infant missing from a residence on Maple Avenue. Foul play has not been ruled out. The phrase, "not ruled out," would follow the family for years. Over the next week, the investigation expanded outward in circles. First, the immediate neighborhood, then nearby towns, then state lines. Patrols checked every motel, diner, and bus station along the highway. A missing person bulletin was sent to hospitals, adoption agencies, and border posts. Officers distributed photographs of the infant. Only one photo existed, taken at 6 weeks, to every station within 100 miles. The print quality was poor, the contrast fading. Still, they circulated it as if clarity could be willed into existence. Leads arrived daily and died just as quickly. A woman in a neighboring town claimed she'd seen a stroller pushed hurriedly into a car. A truck driver reported a bundle left near a rest stop. Both were checked. Neither matched. Each false lead carried its own brief flare of hope, followed by the same extinguishing silence. The search headquarters moved into the town hall basement. Maps covered the walls, dotted with colored pins marking sighting reports and search zones. A coffee pot burned continuously on the back table. Officers took turns sleeping in chairs. The detective in charge, the one who would later keep the case alive, began logging every call in a thick ledger. He numbered them sequentially. By the end of August, the last entry on that first page read, "Call 237, woman in Missouri, reports hearing infant crying behind diner. Unfounded." The family's world had collapsed inward. The mother stopped sleeping upstairs. She stayed near the front window, where she could see the porch. Sometimes she'd step outside and sit in the same chair where the blanket had been, her hands resting on her knees, as if waiting for time to reverse. The father went back to work sooner than anyone expected. People whispered that he was trying to pretend nothing happened. In truth, he said later, he just couldn't stand the sound of the empty house. By early September, the community organized a vigil. Hundreds gathered in front of the courthouse, holding candles. The pastor spoke about faith and endurance. The sheriff promised continued effort. But as the candles burned low and the crowd dispersed, the unspoken truth settled over everyone. No one knew where to search anymore. Then came the letters. Dozens of them were mailed to the police and the family. Some claimed responsibility, others offered cryptic clues. Most were cruel jokes written in shaky cursive or typewriter ink. Each one was opened, logged, analyzed, and dismissed. A few were traced to distant cities, none to the perpetrator, if there even was one. Autumn arrived. The leaves changed, the air cooled, and the story began to fade from headlines. The detective made one last appeal to the public before winter. If anyone knows anything, come forward. No one did. By the start of the new year, the file had been reclassified. Missing infant, suspicious circumstances. The tone of the investigation shifted. Less search, more review. Officers revisited earlier statements, scrutinizing the parents again. Not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. The mother endured hours of interviews, polygraphs, and evaluations. Nothing suggested guilt, only trauma. She answered every question with the same exhausted composure, until one afternoon when she asked a question of her own. If he was taken, then where would he be now? The detective had no answer. Winter turned the house quiet again. Snow piled on the porch rail where the blanket had once been. The garden froze. The photograph on the kitchen wall curled from humidity and time. The case moved to the back shelf, its edges gathering dust. But once a month, almost ritually, the detective reopened the file. He checked for new reports, sent out circular reminders to neighboring jurisdictions, and wrote short memos about future identification potential. At the time, such hope seemed procedural, almost superstitious. The idea of matching a child's identity years later, across states, without physical evidence or shared databases, felt impossible. He couldn't have known that what seemed like a bureaucratic gesture, preserving prints, hair samples, and the single surviving photograph, would one day become the key to solving the mystery. Because when technology finally caught up to what grief had preserved, those artifacts would be the only things left that could speak. The first winter after the disappearance arrived early, covering the town in a brittle hush. News vans that had once lined the curb were gone, replaced by thin drifts of snow and tire tracks from the morning paper delivery. Inside the modest white house on Maple Avenue, the holiday decorations stayed boxed in the attic. The family no longer set up the tree. What once had been a season of routine warmth turned into a calendar of endurance, each day marked only by survival. The mother still woke before dawn. She'd stand by the kitchen window, staring at the gray light forming behind the trees, waiting for a sound, a car door, a voice, anything. In interviews years later, neighbors said they could sometimes see her silhouette at that window, still as a figure carved from glass. Her husband worked longer shifts at the foundry. He'd come home exhausted, covered in soot, and sit in silence at the table. 2 cups of coffee, one left untouched. The investigation had become part of daily life, like weather that refused to clear. Detectives visited weekly, often with nothing new to report. Their questions changed subtly over time, tilting from "who might have taken him" to "how are you coping?" The truth was, they didn't know. Grief had its own geometry. It rearranged the house, the marriage, and the future. By the spring of 1968, the family's savings had drained. The father's overtime barely covered bills. Reporters stopped calling, but the occasional letter still arrived. Some were kind, offering prayers. Others were venomous strangers suggesting theories, blame, and even hoaxes. One claimed the child had been sold to a preacher's wife out west. Another insisted the baby had drowned and been hidden to save the family's shame. None had proof. All were read, filed, and left unanswered. The sheriff's office maintained a standing order. Any infant found abandoned, any questionable adoption, and any hospital record discrepancy were all to be cross-checked against the Maple Avenue file. It was a gesture of persistence more than expectation. They couldn't admit the case was cold, not yet. That spring, a new detective transferred into the department, younger, methodical, and known for patience. He reviewed the file from the beginning, page by page, noticing how sparse it truly was. He underlined a line from the original report. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, no motive discernible. He later told a colleague that the sentence felt too clean, too unfinished, as if the story stopped mid-sentence. He visited the family again, walked the property, and even spoke with neighbors whose memories had already blurred. Still, nothing concrete emerged. The town moved on. The foundry laid off workers. A new grocery opened on the highway. Children grew up and left. But for those who had been there that July afternoon, the memory remained fused to the place. People avoided walking past the house at dusk. Others crossed the street without thinking. The porch itself became a landmark of loss, a place both ordinary and sacred, like a scar. In 1971, the family relocated 2 towns over, chasing quieter streets and a chance to start again. They left the house furnished, renting it to another couple. The mother couldn't bring herself to pack the baby's clothes. She folded them neatly in a small cedar chest and left it in the corner of the bedroom closet. If he ever comes home, she told her sister, he should find something waiting. The years blurred. The detective's annual check-ins continued, even as the case file yellowed. Each memo he wrote ended with the same phrase: further identification pending advances in record technology. It read like wishful bureaucracy, but it was the only tether between past and present the file still had. By the 80s, the disappearance had become a kind of local folklore, the unsolved mystery people mentioned at coffee counters or around campfires, half remembered and quietly exaggerated. Some swore they knew who'd done it. Others said the baby had been found long ago and that the family had gone quiet for reasons best left alone. Myths thrive where truth grows thin. Meanwhile, the parents aged quietly. The father retired and then passed away in the late 90s. His obituary mentioned 2 children, one surviving. The mother remained in the smaller house, surrounded by reminders she didn't discard: a rattle in a drawer, a faded baby photo, and the original flyer folded into a book of psalms. She no longer expected the phone to ring, but she kept the same number, just in case. The detective who had once kept the case alive also retired. Before leaving, he boxed up his open files for the archives, including the Maple Avenue disappearance. But he left a note clipped to the folder: unresolved, possible familial abduction pending identification by future method. 0 says, future method. No one could have guessed what that meant at the time. DNA testing for identification wouldn't become practical for another decade. The word itself barely appeared in investigative manuals then, yet it lingered in the file like a seed. And so the case entered its second life. Not active, not closed, frozen. A single thread stretching through the decades, waiting for something in the modern world to trip over it. The mother grew old, but not forgetful. Each year, on the anniversary, she'd set a candle on the porch railing, light it at dusk, and watch until the flame went out. Sometimes neighbors joined her, sometimes not. In 2009, a local journalist rediscovered the story while researching unsolved cases for a centennial newspaper edition. She contacted the aging mother, who agreed to speak on record for the first time in 40 years. Her words were simple: "I just want to know where he went. I don't even need why anymore." The article ran with a headline nearly identical to the one from 1967. The same black and white photo was reprinted beside it. The same kitchen scene. The same woman, older now, but with the same hands folded tightly together. That article, archived online, would later surface in an unexpected place. Because in 2010, a woman living hundreds of miles away, curious about her own ancestry, typed her name into a genealogy website. The algorithm matched her to that very article, not because of her name, but because of a string of shared DNA markers that connected her to the missing child's surviving sibling. She would read the article twice, then a third time. Something inside her recognized a shape she'd never been able to define. And that is where the decades of silence began to break. The algorithm didn't know what it had done. It simply did what it was built to do: compare fragments, align markers, and trace lineage through patterns of inheritance. But when it connected two people who should have never shared DNA on record, the past began to stir. In the spring of 2010, a woman living in a quiet suburb of Colorado received a notification from a consumer DNA site she joined out of curiosity. It listed a potential biological match, a sibling she'd never heard of, somewhere in the Midwest. The name didn't mean anything to her, but the shared percentage was impossible to ignore. 48% is too high for coincidence, too close for anything other than family. She rechecked the settings, wondering if it was a mistake, but the data held. At first, she thought it was an error in the system. She had been raised an only child, adopted when she was just a few months old. Her parents, both kind and older when they'd taken her in, had passed away years earlier. They'd told her little about her origins, only that she'd come through a private placement that was fully legal, and that her birth mother had been young and unable to care for her. There were no records she could find, no agency name, just a notarized statement and a date: September 1967. The new match, however, didn't align with any of that. The site displayed a map showing an approximate location for the sibling, a woman living in Illinois. When she clicked the link, the profile showed something else: a family tree that listed an infant brother who had disappeared in 1967 and was never found. The post included a newspaper clipping from a small-town archive: "Infant vanishes from front porch. Search continues." The woman stared at the grainy photo attached to the article. The mother's face, younger but unmistakable, looked almost like her own. For 2 days, she couldn't sleep. She printed the article, folded it into her journal, and reread it under the kitchen light. Each sentence felt like a piece of glass being lifted from the floor: fragile, dangerous, and strangely clear. Eventually, she wrote a message through the DNA site's private portal: "Hello. I believe we may be related. I don't know how this could be possible, but your post about your missing brother matches the timeline of my birth record. Can we talk?" She hesitated before pressing send. Once the message went out, there was no retrieving it, no way to unask the question she had just opened. 2 days later, a reply arrived. The woman on the other end introduced herself gently. She explained that her brother had vanished as an infant in 1967, and though the case had gone cold decades ago, her family had never stopped wondering. They'd all assumed he was dead. "If this is real," she wrote, "I need to know." Within a week, the DNA company confirmed the result through further analysis. There was no doubt. The woman raised in Colorado was biologically connected to the Hayes family of Illinois. She wasn't a distant cousin or misclassified relative. She was the missing child, grown up under another name. The discovery moved quickly from curiosity to case file. The genealogical report triggered an automatic alert to the company's legal team, which in turn contacted local authorities. A liaison reached out to the Illinois Bureau of Investigation, referencing the old file number still stored on microfilm. When the message arrived at the county sheriff's office, it landed on a desk that had changed hands half a dozen times since the 70s. The detective who opened it wasn't even born when the disappearance occurred, but he recognized the name immediately. The Maple Avenue case was a local legend. Now it had resurfaced not through witness, confession, or discovery, but through code written in molecules. Within a month, the Colorado woman agreed to formal testing. Blood and saliva samples were collected and cross-referenced with the preserved material from the original investigation. The baby's footprint card, a lock of hair saved by the hospital, and a genetic sample that had been transferred to a state database during the early days of forensic modernization. When the match returned, it was complete. The missing infant from 1967 had lived a full life under another identity, but the revelation didn't come with simplicity. The records surrounding her adoption were murky, notarized in a small town hundreds of miles away, and filed by a private attorney who had since died. The names on the forms were aliases, and the supposed mother who signed the surrender document had never existed. The woman had been raised in a different state, with no connection to the family she'd been taken from. The paper trail looked legitimate on the surface, but every detail beneath it was false. Investigators began reconstructing what must have happened in those missing weeks after July 1967. The working theory grew as documents resurfaced. A woman, possibly a local acquaintance or temporary nurse, had taken the child, traveled out of state, and passed him to an intermediary who specialized in private adoptions. In the 60s, such transactions existed in a gray zone of law and secrecy, often cloaked as charitable placements. It was a system built on trust and silence. For decades, the truth had rested in plain sight, hidden not by malice, but by the paperwork that had once seemed entirely ordinary. When the confirmation finally reached the surviving family, the call came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The surviving sister answered, heard the detective's voice, and felt the years collapse into a single point. "We found him," he said simply. "He's alive." The next morning, news reached the mother, now elderly and living in assisted care. When told that her son had been found, she didn't speak at first. Nurses said she sat still, staring at the sunlight flickering through the blinds, before whispering one line that would later be repeated by the reporters who came knocking. "I knew he wasn't gone. I just didn't know where he went." The reunion that followed was quiet, private, and without cameras or press. Just a small meeting room, 3 people, and 43 years between them. The woman who had once been the missing infant sat across from the family she'd never known. On the table lay the old photo, the mother's hands clasped, the father's weary eyes, and a baby whose future no one could have guessed. There were tears, disbelief, and silence. No grand revelation or cinematic moment, just the quiet shock of recognition, the shared breath of something returned. And in that stillness, one truth became clear. Some mysteries aren't solved by evidence or confession, but by endurance, by the refusal to stop remembering. The formal investigation into the false adoption began quietly, almost cautiously, as if the system itself was reluctant to reopen its own past. By the time the match had been confirmed, nearly every person who had touched the original paperwork was gone, retired, relocated, or deceased. What remained were documents, brittle with age, their typewritten lines half-faded, signatures smudged by decades of handling. But within those pages, the truth still whispered. Detectives began by tracing the chain of custody for the adoption records. The file listed a single attorney of record, a man who had practiced family law in the late 60s and whose name appeared on several other private placements. He had died in 1983, his files scattered or destroyed. The address on the forms led to a vacant office building near the old courthouse, now slated for demolition. Inside, during a last inspection, investigators discovered boxes of abandoned case ledgers left behind in a locked cabinet. The ledgers contained dozens of names of mothers, infants, and adoptive couples, most legitimate, a few questionable. And among them, Written in neat ink on a page dated August 17, 1967, were 3 entries marked only by initials. One matched the date and approximate age of the missing child. The notation beside it read, "Place out of state. Verified personally. No signature. No follow-up note." It wasn't proof, but it was the first real bridge between the baby who had vanished from a porch and the woman who had grown up believing she was adopted lawfully. Investigators widened the net. They pulled birth certificates, county health records, and notarized adoption decrees from the late 60s. Many of the documents followed a similar pattern. Clean paperwork, same typist, same witnesses. It became clear that a small, informal network had been operating then, linking hospitals, lawyers, and intermediaries who facilitated off-the-record placements. Not all were criminal in intent. Some were driven by compassion in an era with few protections for single mothers. But others exploited the lack of oversight to supply babies to desperate couples willing to pay cash. In the Maple Avenue case, the evidence suggested a middle path, an abduction that had been quickly laundered into legitimacy by a broken system. One retired nurse, tracked down through a nursing registry, provided a critical clue. She remembered a woman who had appeared at a local clinic shortly after the disappearance, claiming to be recovering from childbirth and requesting formula for a newborn. The nurse recalled her as nervous but polite, maybe in her 30s, with a story that didn't feel rehearsed but didn't feel real either. She had signed her name as Ellen Price. No such name appeared in the town's census or medical records. The nurse remembered one more thing. The woman drove an older model tan sedan with a baby seat in the back. When detectives compared that memory to the original reports from 1967, they found the same description: a tan sedan, seen idling near the corner that afternoon. The threads were aligning, not tightly, but enough to form a shape. They concluded that the woman likely took the infant directly to another county, where she connected with someone in the attorney's circle. Within a week, forged paperwork had been filed under the name of a fictitious mother. The child was registered as born in a different town, and within 2 months, he was in the hands of an unsuspecting adoptive couple hundreds of miles away. It was not the story anyone wanted, but it was the story that made sense. When the report was delivered to the district attorney, he read it twice, folded it neatly, and said what everyone already knew: there would be no prosecution. The statute of limitations had long expired. The key participants were dead. The law could no longer reach backward that far. And yet, the work mattered. The truth, even delayed, had weight. The official statement released to the press was measured through modern DNA comparison and cooperative genealogical research. The case, originating in July 1967, has been resolved. The individual reported missing has been identified, located, and reunited with family. Investigation into historical irregularities related to private adoption practices of the era continues. That last phrase, historical irregularities, carried an entire world of pain beneath its bureaucratic calm. For the woman at the center of it all, the revelations came in waves. She had grown up loved, safe, and unaware that her beginnings had been built on someone else's grief. The knowledge did not erase that love, but it altered its foundation. She described the feeling later in a private statement as standing on familiar ground and realizing it was borrowed. She began piecing together her own parallel timeline. The foster agency that had introduced her to her adoptive parents was legitimate but unknowing. They'd been handed documents that appeared authentic. The lawyer who had arranged it had spoken convincingly, promising confidentiality and discretion. There had been no reason to doubt him. In 1967, secrecy around adoption was not suspicious. It was expected. Now, in the modern light of DNA certainty, that same secrecy looked like complicity. Across the country, journalists began to connect the case to a broader history: the shadow market of mid-century adoptions, the gray space between charity and crime. Newspapers ran headlines like "DNA cracks, 1967 baby case, system flaws exposed." But the family, both biological and adoptive, declined interviews. They had no appetite for spectacle. In private, the surviving sister described the reunion as both everything and not enough. She and her mother had lived with a ghost for 4 decades. Now, the ghost had a heartbeat and a face, but the years between them were a void that could never be crossed. They met often at first, for long, awkward lunches and conversations about childhood, music, and work. They were learning each other's lives, like reading a book from the middle. One afternoon, the daughter visited the old house on Maple Avenue. The new owners let her stand on the porch. She touched the railing where the paint still peeled in faint layers. She said it felt smaller than she'd imagined, and that the silence of the place was like standing inside a paused moment. That night, she drove back to her hotel, sat in the parking lot for almost an hour, and cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange understanding that she had been both lost and found in the same world. The next morning, she called her mother, not the woman who had raised her, but the one who had waited. "I'm still yours," she said simply. The older woman, her voice thin but steady, replied, "You always were." And with that, the record labeled "Missing Infant Suspicious Circumstances" was finally marked recovered. But the story didn't end there. Because even as one family found closure, the investigation had uncovered a web of similar files of other infants placed through the same attorney and other dates with missing paperwork. The detectives couldn't help wondering how many other names were out there, printed neatly in ink on yellowing pages, waiting for their own match to appear on a screen one day. The past, it seemed, was full of lives misplaced but not forgotten. When word of the resolution spread, it moved not like breaking news but like an aftershock, quiet, delayed, and deeply felt. The town that had once filled its fields with search parties awoke to headlines, declaring what many had stopped hoping to read: "Missing Child, from 1967, found alive." Underneath, the subheading is added in smaller letters: "Identified through modern DNA technology." For most, it was disbelief before joy. 43 years was longer than some lifetimes. The people who remembered the original search were gray-haired now. Others had only grown up hearing the story repeated at family gatherings, a local ghost tale. To see it suddenly concluded scientifically undeniably felt almost unreal. Reporters arrived from regional stations, filming the old neighborhood. They framed the porch, the street sign, and the trees that had outlived generations. The footage carried a strange serenity. The same place, the same light, but a different century. The town mayor gave a short statement on camera. "We never stopped wondering. Maybe now we can start remembering instead." At the courthouse, the sheriff's office held a small press briefing. The lead detective, speaking carefully, credited advances in DNA genealogy and the persistence of public data. Behind him, the faded black-and-white photo from 1967 stood on an easel. It showed the young couple beside the missing child's crib, a picture that had once been circulated in every gas station and grocery store from here to the state line. The photo was both an artifact and apology, a reminder that they had all lived too long without answers. The detective who'd kept the file alive decades earlier had passed away, but his name was mentioned with gratitude. "He left notes that kept this case visible," one officer said. "He believed the truth doesn't expire, only our patience does." For the first time in years, the town held a gathering not of mourning but of closure. A local church hosted a quiet service. There were no banners, no speeches, only a candlelight vigil that ended with the tolling of a single bell, one ring for each decade of absence. The impact, however, extended far beyond that town's borders. Legislators began reviewing adoption laws from the 60s and 70s, recognizing how easily such cases had slipped through bureaucratic cracks. Legal scholars noted that the lack of interstate oversight had allowed abductions to masquerade as private adoptions. Newspapers across the country published editorials urging the creation of national databases for missing children and unverified adoptions. The case became part of training curricula for forensic genealogists. At conferences, its details were presented as a model of how DNA, family records, and simple curiosity could converge to rewrite history. The phrase, the Maple Avenue precedent, began appearing in law enforcement seminars as shorthand for the idea that cold cases were never truly cold, only waiting for the right kind of persistence. In homes across the country, families who had endured similar losses began sending saliva samples to testing companies, hoping their results might open their own locked doors. Some found distant cousins. A few found the beginnings of answers. Others simply learned what they'd always known, that silence had weight, and that waiting was its own kind of labor. For the woman who had been the missing child, the attention was bewildering. She declined most interviews, preferring to process the truth privately. "I don't owe the world a story," she told one reporter kindly, "but I owe my family the time to live ours." She returned to her life in Colorado quietly, visiting Illinois a few times each year. The first visit had been emotional. The second was steadier. By the third, she brought her own children. They stood on the porch where her life had split in two, the before and the after, joined only by memory. Her daughter, old enough to understand fragments of the story, asked, "So this is where you were born?" She smiled faintly. "Something like that," she said. For her mother, now frail but lucid, the reunion changed the texture of her remaining days. She spoke more and smiled more. Staff at the care facility said she often kept a framed photo beside her bed, her grown daughter holding her grandchildren, sunlight in the background. When asked about it, she'd simply say, "That's my miracle. It took the world 40 years to find her, but it did." In interviews, the detectives emphasized that this wasn't an isolated miracle of technology, but the result of ordinary perseverance. "Cases like these survive because someone refuses to close a drawer," one officer said. "Every generation adds a tool. Sometimes that's enough." Beyond the headlines, policy began to shift. State agencies created new requirements for verifying private adoptions and preserving historical records. Hospital procedures were audited, archives digitized, and birth registries cross-linked across states. Each reform carried the faint echo of 1967, a promise written in legislation that such a disappearance could never happen unnoticed again. But the story's emotional reach was even greater. People wrote letters to the family from across the country, not out of voyeurism but recognition. Many had lived parallel losses: children surrendered, siblings missing, parents searching. Some enclosed photographs of their own, annotated with hope. "Maybe someday, someone will find us too." In classrooms, teachers used the case to discuss ethics and progress, how compassion, without accountability, can turn dangerous, and how technology can restore what trust once broke. In sermons, pastors used it to speak about endurance and forgiveness. The woman herself avoided such public framing. She lived simply and privately, and when asked what the discovery meant to her, she said only, "It gave me back the piece of my story that was missing. That's enough." Back in Illinois, the old Maple Avenue house still stood. The porch had been repainted, the railing replaced. The neighborhood was quieter now, older. Yet sometimes, especially in late summer, when the air hung thick and still, residents swore they could hear a faint echo, not a cry, not a voice, but the sound of a screen door closing gently, as if finishing a sentence left open for too long. By then, the candlelight vigil had become an annual tradition, not of grief anymore, but of continuity. Each year, the family lit one candle for the years of absence, and another for the years reclaimed. The two flames, side by side, represented loss and return, both necessary, both true. It wasn't about celebration, it was about balance. And as the camera crews faded, as the headlines cooled, as life folded back into its quiet rhythms, the story settled into history. Not sensational, not tragic, but human. A story about patience, about the long arc of truth-bending, eventually toward the light. Because sometimes the smallest sample of DNA isn't just evidence. It's a map, one that leads home. In the months after the reunion, life for everyone involved became a slow process of translation, turning fact into understanding and understanding into something that could be lived with. No one spoke much about the years that had passed. There were too many of them, and none of them could be reclaimed. Instead, they talked about small things, favorite colors, childhood foods, the weather in different states, the kind of conversations families usually have early in life, but that these people were having decades late, learning one another in reverse. The woman who had been the missing child began keeping a journal. She filled it with memories that weren't hers, but that she wanted to claim. Stories from her mother about the old porch, the sound of cicadas, and the scent of the lilac bush that used to bloom beside the front steps. She wrote them down, not to erase her adoptive life, but to add to it, to finally see the whole of herself in one unbroken thread. She described the moment she'd told her own children the truth. They had listened quietly, heads tilted, confusion and wonder trading places across their faces. Her son asked if that made him half adopted. She laughed softly. "No," she said. "It just makes us lucky." Meanwhile, her mother, the woman who had once searched fields and riverbanks for a lost infant, found a kind of peace that those around her hadn't thought possible. The staff at the assisted living home noticed subtle changes. She ate better. She smiled at strangers again. Sometimes she hummed as she folded towels in the communal laundry room, a habit she hadn't shown in years. The return of her child, however belated, had lifted something invisible from her shoulders. On quiet afternoons, she would sit by the window, the light cutting thin gold stripes across the room, and talk to visiting nurses about faith. "People think faith is believing something will happen," she said once. "But real faith is believing that even if it doesn't, the truth still matters." Her surviving daughter, the one who had lived under the shadow of the missing sibling for most of her life, found her own adjustment harder. For her, the disappearance had been both a tragedy and a defining element of identity. Growing up, she had been the child who stayed, the one who reminded everyone of what had been taken. Now, with her brother found alive, she faced the strange ache of joy mixed with displacement. "It's like the story changed endings without asking me," she said quietly to a friend. But with time, that feeling softened. She and her newly found sibling began to speak weekly, then daily, trading photographs and half-forgotten stories from both sides of the divide. They discovered similarities that startled them. The same slight tilt of the head when thinking, the same preference for quiet rooms, and the same nervous habit of tapping a thumb against a table edge. Traits that had survived decades apart, carried in silence through DNA alone. The investigation officially closed that winter. The file that had once filled drawers was condensed into a slim digital folder with a few scanned documents, lab reports, and a single notation, recovered through genealogical confirmation, 2010. When the clerk uploaded it to the state database, she paused before clicking save. "It's strange," she told her supervisor. "It feels like closing a door that was never supposed to stay open this long." Back in Colorado, the woman visited her adoptive parents' graves. She left flowers and a note folded between the headstones. It said only, "Thank you for giving me a life, even if it wasn't the one anyone expected." She didn't feel betrayal or anger. She understood that love could exist inside lies when the lie had been built to protect, not to harm. What had happened in 1967 wasn't her fault, nor theirs, nor even entirely the fault of one vanished stranger. It had been the consequence of a system that confused secrecy with mercy. One evening, while visiting Illinois, she sat with her biological mother, watching old home videos that the surviving sister had transferred from film reels. Most showed family gatherings long after her disappearance. Christmas dinners, birthdays, the slow aging of everyone except her. At one point, her mother pointed to the screen, where her younger self smiled nervously at a camera. "That was the year after," she said. "I didn't think I could be in front of a camera again, but your father said, maybe if we were seen, it meant you'd see us too." The woman reached over and held her mother's hand. Neither spoke. The tape hissed softly, the image flickering between past and present. In the following years, the family found rhythm again. Not the rhythm of what once was, but of what could still be. They met every summer for a week in the countryside. 3 generations gathered around the same table, the conversations a blend of memory and discovery. The porch candlelight vigil became less about the missing and more about the found. Neighbors noticed. People who had lived long enough to remember the search would stop by to say hello. One elderly man, who had helped comb the fields back in 1967, said softly, "I always thought that child deserved to know the world kept looking." The woman smiled. "It did," she said. "Even when no one knew, they were still looking." For her, closure didn't mean the story was over. It meant she could finally live without wondering which parts of herself were missing. The mystery had turned into history, and history, at last, into life. The candle on the porch rail still burned each July, but now the family gathered around it with laughter instead of tears. Children played in the yard, their voices echoing across the same fence lines that had once carried cries for help. The air smelled of lilacs again, and as the evening light faded, someone would always say the same words the detective had written in his final memo. The truth doesn't expire. It only waits. It had waited 43 years. And then, when the world finally learned to listen, it answered. By the time the decade turned, the Maple Avenue disappearance had become something larger than a single family's story. It had turned into a mirror, one that reflected how an era's trust, secrecy, and silence could coexist so comfortably that no one thought to question them. Historians began using the case as a cultural marker, a way to understand what the late 60s had believed about privacy and authority. The lesson was simple but haunting. People assumed safety because they believed the system was moral. At universities, criminal justice departments added the story to their ethics syllabi under a heading called Failures of Procedure and the Resilience of Memory. The students who studied it were born long after 1967, yet the case still felt immediate to them. They recognized something familiar in that ordinary moment. A phone call, a knock at the door, a uniform that looked right, could split reality in two. Professors told them that what saved the case wasn't luck or technology alone, but documentation. Someone, somewhere, had always written things down. A photograph, a footprint card, and a police memo. The paper trail was the lifeline that allowed a future generation to reach back across 4 decades and say, "This happened, and this was the proof." Journalists revisited the story every few years, usually around anniversaries. Each retelling grew less about crime and more about persistence. The mother's candle, the detective's file, and the quiet faith that evidence would outlive ignorance. The tone changed over time. Where early articles had been desperate or sensational, modern ones were reverent, almost pastoral. A headline from 2020 read, "The Porch That Waited for an Answer." Documentarians filmed interviews with those still alive who had touched the case. The surviving sister appeared briefly, her words measured and soft. "People think truth fixes things," she said. "It doesn't. It steadies them." In another segment, one of the forensic genealogists described the moment their computer first displayed the match. "The data was clinical," she said, "but when I realized what it meant, I had to stand up. 43 years of silence, broken by a string of letters and numbers, that's humbling." The woman herself, the former missing child, declined to appear. She wrote a short statement instead. It was read aloud at the end of the documentary. "We spend our lives trying to understand where we come from. For most people, the answer is a story told at the dinner table. For me, it was a file in an archive. I'm grateful for both." Audiences responded not with shock but with empathy. The case had ceased to be a mystery and become a meditation on how families survive what the world forgets. Policy reforms continued quietly in the background. By 2015, every state had adopted guidelines requiring cross-state verification of adoption paperwork. Birth records were digitized, searchable, and, where consent allowed, publicly accessible. The Maple Avenue file, once a stack of yellowing pages, now lived online in a digital museum of solved cold cases, each entry a reminder that time's decay could be reversed by persistence. Yet the story retained an aura of something sacred. Visitors to the old town often asked directions to the house. The new owners, weary but polite, eventually placed a small bronze plaque by the fence post to keep people from knocking. It read simply, "This home once held a mystery. It has since been found." Each July, the local newspaper still printed a small column written by a rotating staff member. The title never changed, "The Candle on Maple Avenue." It recounted how one family's loss had reshaped the town's understanding of faith, evidence, and endurance. But beyond policy and commemoration, there was the deeper current, the one that had nothing to do with headlines or laws. The story had changed how people thought about disappearance itself. It reminded them that vanishing was not always a matter of death or crime, but of bureaucracy, neglect, or misplaced compassion. It taught communities to look twice at what seemed ordinary. One social worker who specialized in reunion counseling later said, "That case made people realize that closure doesn't mean justice. It means continuity. The line goes on, even when you lose sight of it." In the mother's final years, she kept her world small but open. She wrote short notes to families who reached out to her after reading about the case. One of them said, "Don't give up, but don't stop living while you wait." Another read, "The ones we lose are still watching the path home. Keep the porch light on." She died peacefully at 92, her daughter by her side. On her bedside table was the same candle she'd lit every July, its wax layered by years. At her funeral, the family placed that candle beside the guest book. They lit it once more as the service ended. Her son, the man she had lost and found, delivered a few words. He spoke quietly, not to eulogize, but to complete a circle. "For 43 years, he said, she kept the door open. When I finally stepped through, she didn't ask why I was late. She just said, 'Welcome home.' There was no applause, no media present, and no cameras. Only the sound of wind through the cemetery oaks and the slow creak of branches overhead." Afterward, the family returned to Maple Avenue one last time. The house was different, but the porch steps still led to the same rhythm of wood and air. They placed the candle on the railing, lit it, and waited until dusk. A few neighbors stopped by, offering nods of recognition. No one spoke much. The light flickered, small against the evening. When the flame finally went out, the woman, the one once called missing, reached for her daughter's hand and said, "That's enough light for now. We know the way." The family left the candle there overnight. In the morning, a breeze had carried its smoke down the block, the faint scent lingering like a memory that refused to fade. The Maple Avenue case had begun as a loss, endured as a question, and ended as a lesson. That memory is its own form of justice. Sometimes, the best thing a community can do is to remember loudly enough that forgetting becomes impossible. And somewhere, in the quiet of the digital archives, the old case file remained open. Not because it needed more evidence, but because history itself never really closes. In the years that followed, the Maple Avenue story moved quietly from fact into folklore. Not the mythical kind told around campfires, but the kind whispered between generations when people try to remind one another that faith and patience still mean something. Children who had never known the missing years grew up hearing their parents refer to a porch light that never went out, even if they didn't know whose porch it had been. Teachers mentioned the case in civics lessons, about accountability and the need for public records. Reporters called it a proof of persistence, a reminder that not every mystery ends in tragedy, and that truth, though slow, still travels. In a museum dedicated to the state's historical archives, a small exhibit was created using the original case materials. Behind glass sat the faded missing person flyer, its ink nearly dissolved to sepia, the words, "Have you seen this child?" barely legible. Beside it, a more recent photograph showed a smiling adult, the caption simple, "Identified. 2010. Between them, curators placed a small brass tag engraved with a phrase attributed to the detective, who never gave up. Time is a witness, not a wall. Visitors lingered longer at that display than at almost any other. They didn't stare at the documents for evidence. They stared for recognition of endurance, of unfinished love, of the human instinct to wait for answers, even when the world insists there are none left to find. Every few months, letters still arrived at the County Historical Society. They came from people who had lost children, parents, or siblings decades ago and wanted to know how to begin again. Some enclosed family photos, others DNA kit barcodes. The archivist who handled the mail kept a separate drawer labeled Hope Files. She said it wasn't an official procedure, just something that felt right. Meanwhile, in Colorado, the woman whose name had been missing from her own birth certificate continued her work as a counselor. She specialized in helping adoptees and families affected by long-term separations. Most clients never realized who she was. She never introduced herself as the girl from the story. She simply listened. Her office wall held no photographs of the past, only a single framed quote that read, "The truth is never late. It just takes the long way home." On anniversaries, journalists still reached out, hoping she might comment on some new cold case that had recently been solved through DNA. Her replies were always polite but brief. "It's not about me," she'd write. "It's about what patients can do when the world finally has the tools to listen." In her home, tucked inside a drawer, was a small wooden box containing the few artifacts that tied her to that vanished spring of 1967. A photocopy of the original hospital bracelet, a clipping from the newspaper announcing her recovery, and a candle stub taken from her mother's final vigil. Each item was ordinary and fragile, but together they formed the spine of a life rebuilt from absence. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would light that candle, not for grief, not even for ritual, just to watch the light move across the room. She said it reminded her that stories like hers weren't really about disappearance or recovery, but about continuity. "The same flame," she once told a close friend, "just passed from one pair of hands to another until it found me again." At the old police station in Illinois, the shelves once stacked with paper files had long since been replaced by digital terminals. But in the corner office, the original case binder still sat in a glass frame, its spine cracked, its pages yellowed. Beneath it, a small plaque bore a single line, "Closed, but never forgotten." Officers new to the department would pause to read it on their first day, absorbing the lesson before their training began. The town itself had changed. The mills that once employed half its population were gone. Subdivisions and small cafes filled the outskirts. Yet every July, someone still placed a single white candle on the courthouse steps without note or explanation. The flame burned through the night and into the morning, even in rain. Locals called it the porch light for everyone still waiting. News outlets sometimes picked up photographs of it, calling the gesture symbolic. But for those who had lived through the case, it wasn't symbolism, it was an inheritance. A quiet acknowledgement that truth, once found, must be kept illuminated so it doesn't slip back into the dark. Sociologists later wrote that what distinguished this story from thousands of other cold cases wasn't merely the resolution, it was how the community carried the aftermath. There was no spectacle, no hunger for sensational detail. The people who'd spent years combing fields and checking fences had learned something deeper, that the pursuit of truth isn't a chase, it's a vigil. In the broader culture, the phrase porch light case began appearing in media shorthand for long unsolved disappearances that were eventually closed through persistence and science. To keep the porch light on became a phrase of quiet defiance, spoken at vigils and fundraisers for missing persons across the country. The original family's endurance had become language itself, a metaphor transformed into a movement. The woman saw this occasionally on news broadcasts. Strangers using her family's phrase. It made her smile, not with pride, but with a kind of gentle acceptance. If our light helps someone else find the way, she said once. "Then we've done what we were supposed to do." As the half-century mark approached, a local filmmaker proposed a memorial documentary. She agreed only on the condition that it end not with her face or her name, but with the candle on the porch, burning steadily as dawn approached. "Because that's how these stories really end," she told him. "Not with a door closing, but with someone remembering to keep watch." The final scene of that film, broadcast nationally, showed exactly that. A quiet suburban street, porch lights glowing one by one as the night softened into morning. No narration, no music, just the sound of cicadas and a single candle flame holding its shape against the wind. It was not an ending. It was an understanding that remembering is its own form of rescue. By the time the story reached its half-century mark, the case no longer belonged to investigators or reporters. It belonged to everyone who had ever waited in silence for an answer. The Maple Avenue porch, once a private place of grief, had become a kind of compass point, proof that even after 4 decades, a single candle can guide something home. Each summer, people who had never met the family began mailing candles to the town. Some came from across the country, others from overseas, wrapped with notes that read only, "For those still waiting." Local volunteers gathered the boxes, placed the candles along the old riverbank, and lit them as dusk fell. The flames reflected across the water, hundreds of tiny witnesses swaying in the evening air. It became an unspoken ritual, light for what was found and light for what remains unfound. On the 50th anniversary, the woman, no longer a child, not yet elderly, returned once more. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her presence unnoticed by most. She didn't give speeches. She didn't stand beside the officials or the cameras. She simply watched the candles ripple down the shoreline until they looked like constellations set afloat. For the first time in her life, she felt no division between who she had been and who she had become. When someone nearby asked what drew her there each year, she said, "Because remembering doesn't belong to just one family. It belongs to everyone who refuses to forget." As darkness deepened, the crowd began to drift home. The candles burned lower. Wind brushed the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wax and river mist. The sound of the town, the hum of tires, a dog barking, a screen door closing, folded softly back into the rhythm of an ordinary night. In the days that followed, articles appeared again, each one retelling the story in new words but keeping the same heart. Half a century later, the light still burns on Maple Avenue. Readers left comments beneath them, sharing where they were watching from Maine, Texas, Oregon, across the ocean. They mentioned their own unsolved stories, their own porch lights still burning. And in that chorus of digital voices, the spirit of the case lived on, not as tragedy, but as connection. For the narrator who tells it now, the lesson is simple. The measure of a story isn't in how loudly it's told, but in how long it keeps being remembered. Truth, once spoken, becomes a kind of inheritance passed hand to hand, voice to voice, screen to screen, ensuring that even the quietest lives are not erased by time. So when you hear about a disappearance, when you see an old flyer yellowed by rain, or a case marked unsolved in the corner of a news page, think of that porch light on Maple Avenue. Think of a mother who refused to stop hoping, a child who found her way home, and a community that learned the difference between closure and memory. Because these stories, however distant in time, belong to all of us. They remind us that patience is not surrender, and that silence does not mean the search is over. Somewhere, in another town, another family still waits, another candle still burns, and every view, every word shared, keeps that light alive a little longer. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment below with where you're watching from and the exact time on your clock. Tell us your city, your state, your hour, and your place on the map of those who remember. And if you believe, as we do, that the past should never stay buried, subscribe to join us as we uncover more true stories where time itself becomes the witness. Because remembering is how we keep the truth alive, and somewhere, another light is waiting to be seen.